Imagine this. You're at your lake house, far away from everyone. In the middle of the night, there's a knock at your door. Soaking wet, injured people are begging for your help. You let them in. An hour later, you realize you just opened your door to the very people who tried to kill your daughter, and they are sleeping in the next room. What would you do? And before we continue, write in the comments what city you're from and what the weather is like. I genuinely love to read it. Enjoy the show. Sunlight pierced through the dense canopy of pine trees, casting intermittent, hypnotic stripes across the windshield of the old Jeep Grand Cherokee. Green and golden glints slid across the dashboard, over John's hands gripping the steering wheel, and across Emma's face as she stared out the window. The lakeside highway twisted and turned, hugging the hills of the remote woods, with the forest standing on both sides like a dense, impenetrable wall. The world beyond the glass was a perfect summer postcard, bright, lush, and full of life. But inside the SUV, the silence was thick and heavy, like lake bed silt. John drove on autopilot. His body remembered every curve of this road, every turn leading them from the noisy city to their quiet sanctuary on the shore of the lake. He remembered driving here for the first time, years ago, when the lake house was just a purchase, a promise of the future. He remembered bringing a newborn Murray here. The car back then had buzzed with children's laughter, arguments, songs, and the endless questions of, "Are we there yet?" Now, the only sounds were the steady hum of the engine, the quiet whoosh of tires on asphalt, and the music seeping from Murray's earbuds in the back seat, muffled, distant beats she used to wall herself off from them, from this world, from herself. He shot a quick glance into the rearview mirror. Murray was hunched over her phone, her face hidden behind a curtain of blonde hair. She wasn't looking out the window. It was as if she were deliberately refusing to see this beauty, these places she once loved more than anything. For her, this road was no longer a path to freedom and joy. It was a path to the epicenter of her pain. John looked away. The feeling of helplessness was almost physically unbearable for him. He was a surgeon. He was used to solving problems. He cut open human bodies, fixed broken bones, stitched torn tissues. He brought people back to life. But he couldn't fix his own family. He couldn't find the words to sew together the edges of the wound that gaped between him, his wife, and his daughter. The wound left after the lake took their son. Emma stared at the flashing trees but didn't see them. Her gaze was unfocused. She was thinking the same thing as John, about the silence. A year ago, this silence had crashed down on them, and they still hadn't learned how to live in it. They just existed within it, moving in their own orbits, afraid to collide, afraid to cause each other more pain with a careless word. This trip had been her idea, a desperate, perhaps foolish, attempt to go back to a time when the lake house was their happy place. She thought that if they came here together, they could find each other again. But now, feeling the icy alienation radiating from her daughter and the quiet sorrow of her husband, she wasn't so sure. Maybe she had just brought them all back to the scene of the crime. She knew what Murray was thinking about how she and her brother used to race from the car to the water, about how her laughter mixed with his, about how the water, her element, her passion, had become her enemy. Murray was born for the water. She could swim before she could walk confidently. Competitions, medals, the admiration of her coaches, that had been her life. Until that day. After that, she never went into the water again. It was as if she were punishing herself by taking away the one thing she loved most. Emma wanted to reach out, to touch her daughter's shoulder, but she knew Murray would only retreat deeper into her cocoon of music and silence. In the back seat, Murray felt their gazes without lifting her head. She knew they were watching her, worrying, trying to understand something, and it infuriated her. They couldn't understand. No one could. They weren't there on the water that day. They hadn't seen a fun game turn into a nightmare. They hadn't heard the silence that came after. They just got the news. But she was there. She was the older sister. She was supposed to watch him. That thought had been eating her away like acid for a whole year. She turned up the volume in her headphones. The heavy beat filled her head, pushing out the thoughts. She scrolled through her phone's feed. Other people's happy lives. Parties, smiles, hugs. Everything that now seemed fake and impossible to her. She hated them for this trip, for making her come back here, to this house that was no longer a home, but a monument to her brother. Every floorboard, every boulder on the shore held his laughter, his voice. And she knew that as soon as they arrived, these memories would pounce on her like a pack of hungry wolves. The car turned off the highway onto a dirt road, and the sound under the wheels changed. Smooth asphalt gave way to crunching gravel. The sound was painfully familiar. It meant they were almost there. Murray felt everything inside her tighten. She looked out the window. Ahead, around the bend, the roof of their house appeared, and behind it, the calm surface of the lake glittered in the sun. The lake lay there, peaceful and beautiful, as if nothing had happened, as if it wasn't a murderer. John killed the engine. The hum died, and the silence became absolute. For a few seconds, no one moved. They sat in the still car, looking at the house that had witnessed their greatest happiness and their most terrible grief. Then John slowly opened his door. The air rushed into the car, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the woods, a cuckoo called out. They got out of the car. Emma stretched, trying to shake off the numbness. John walked around the car and opened the trunk. Their movements were slow, almost ritualistic. They took out bags, groceries from Walmart. Mary got out last, pulling the earbuds from her ears. The silence was deafening. She looked at the lake. The water was calm, almost a mirror, reflecting the white clouds. On the old wooden dock stood two faded plastic lounge chairs, hers and his. Her heart skipped a beat. They went inside the house. It smelled the way a long, unoccupied lake house always does, of dust, old wood, and memories. John walked through the rooms, throwing open the windows, letting in light and fresh air. He tried to act cheerful, to fill the house with life, to chase away the ghosts. Emma went to the kitchen and began to unpack the groceries. She moved mechanically, her thoughts far away. Mary went up to her room on the second floor. Everything was exactly as it had been last summer. A stack of books on the desk, her medals hanging on the wall, a photograph of her and her brother squinting in the sun, hugging on the dock. She walked to the window. It offered the best view of the lake. She looked at the water, and two feelings fought within her soul, her former love and a new, all-consuming hatred. She couldn't stay here, not today. She needed air. She needed to escape. She went downstairs. Her parents were in the kitchen. Their quiet conversation stopped the moment she walked in. She saw hope and fear in their eyes. They wanted so badly for everything to be like it was before, but it wouldn't be, ever again. "Can I take the car?" Her voice sounded louder and harsher than she intended. "I want to go into town. Paige is here. We were supposed to meet up." John and Emma exchanged a look. Their expressions held a whole range of emotions. The reluctance to let her go, the fear of being left alone in this house, but also the understanding that they couldn't keep her here by force. It was the first day. They didn't want to start it with a conflict. After a short pause that felt like an eternity to Mary, John nodded. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and held them out to her. The metal was cold. "Be careful," he said. It was all he could say. "Okay," Mary threw back, not looking him in the eye. She took the keys and left the house without looking back. She got in the car, started the engine, and took off abruptly, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust. She sped down the forest road, away from the house, away from the lake, away from her parents and their silent grief. She wanted only one thing, to forget, for a few hours, who she was and where she was. Where? She didn't yet know that this short trip into town would be the beginning of the end. And John and Emma were left standing in the kitchen, listening to the fading sound of the engine, as the silence in the old house closed in around them with a new, ominous force. The small town greeted Murray with its usual summer sleepiness. Everything was in its place. The same pharmacy on the corner, the same diner with its faded awning, the same small grocery store that smelled of fresh bread and sawdust. She parked the SUV, and for a moment, it seemed as if nothing had changed, that the past year had just been a bad dream. But that feeling lasted only until Paige burst out of the store, her bright, carefree energy crashing into Murray's fragile world. They hugged. Paige's hug was tight, alive, smelling of gum and cheap perfume. She immediately started chattering, bombarding Murray with questions, not letting her get a word in. How was the drive? How were her parents? How was she? Paige was a good friend, but her cheerfulness was almost unbearable right now. She was like bright sunlight to a person who had spent too long in the dark. They wandered aimlessly down the main street. Paige talked about her summer plans, about a party on Saturday, about some guy who worked at the barbecue joint. Murray listened with half an ear, nodding, sometimes even trying to smile. She felt like an actress in someone else's play. She wanted to be like Paige, light, free, thinking only about what color nail polish to choose. But she couldn't. Her thoughts kept returning to the lake house, to the lake, to the 2 lounge chairs on the dock. At one point, Paige, noticing her detachment, stopped. She took Murray's hands and looked into her eyes. Her usual cheerfulness vanished for a moment. She asked if everything was okay, and Murray almost gave in, almost told her everything, about the silence in the car, the emptiness in the house, the hatred for the water that was once her best friend. But she couldn't. It was too hard, too complicated. She just shrugged and said she was fine, just tired from the drive. Paige didn't believe her but didn't press. Instead, she suggested a way to unwind. She had a plan. She knew a guy, Justin, who worked at that same grocery store. He was a little weird but nice, and rumor had it you could get a little weed from him, just to relax, to forget about everything for a couple of hours. Murray hesitated. She had never done anything like that. It wasn't her style. She was an athlete, a swimmer, used to discipline and control, but the old Mari no longer existed, and the new Mari was ready to do anything to numb the pain, just for a little while. She wanted to stop feeling, just for an hour. She agreed. The motel was on the very edge of town, its name clearly an attempt to sound better than it was. Peeling paint, a neon sign with a burnt-out letter, rows of identical doors leading into small, soulless rooms. Paige knocked confidently on number 12. The door was opened by Justin. He was exactly as Paige had described him. Skinny, slightly stooped, with large, frightened eyes like a fawn's. He clearly wasn't expecting to see Paige with a strange girl and got flustered. He let them in, awkwardly offering them the only chair and the edge of the bed. The room was tiny and neglected. Clothes were strewn on the floor, and on a small table sat an empty pizza box and several beer bottles. The air was stale. Justin, stammering, introduced himself. Murray said her name. He seemed to recognize her. He said he'd seen her pictures in old local newspapers when she won swimming competitions. He asked if she still swam. The question was a punch to the gut. Murray went cold. She snapped that no, she didn't swim anymore. An awkward silence hung in the room. Paige, trying to save the situation, cheerfully got down to business. Justin, even more embarrassed, rummaged in a desk drawer and pulled out a small, tightly rolled baggie. The whole scene was more pathetic than dangerous. Justin wasn't a drug dealer, just a lonely, bullied teenager trying to make a little money and maybe some friends. He offered the girls a beer. He turned on an old TV where scenes from some stupid talk show flickered across the screen. The three of them sat in this miserable room, and Mari felt a wave of disappointment and longing wash over her. She thought this would help her escape, but she had only traded one prison for another. She wanted to get up and leave, go back to the car, drive anywhere. She was about to do it. She had already opened her mouth to tell Paige it was time to go. But at that very moment, the doorknob turned. The door flew open with such force that it slammed against the wall, and on the threshold, they appeared. The first to step into the room was Krug. He was like a predator invading a cage of rabbits. His presence instantly sucked all the air out of the small room. He wasn't huge, but he radiated an aura of such concentrated cold cruelty that Murray's breath caught in her throat. Behind him, like shadows, entered his brother Francis, twitchy and nervous with darting eyes, and his girlfriend Sadie, with a predatory, lazy smile on her painted lips. Justin jumped up, knocking over a beer bottle. Sheer terror was written on his face. He stammered that they were his friends, that they had just stopped by. But Krug wasn't looking at him. He slowly scanned the room with his heavy, appraising gaze. His eyes settled on Paige, who was frozen with her mouth half open. Then he looked at Murray. He looked at her for a long time, indifferently, as if she were an object, not a person. And in that moment, Murray's world finally ceased to be what it was. She realized that the quiet lake house wasn't a prison. It was paradise, and real hell had just opened its doors to her. The air in the room thickened, becoming viscous like tar. It filled her lungs and seemed to stop the blood in her veins. Murray froze, not daring to move. Every muscle in her body turned to stone. She saw how fear twisted Paige's face, turning her from a carefree girl into a cornered animal. She saw how Justin cowered under his father's gaze, as if expecting a blow. Krug moved through the room with a slow, predatory grace. He wasn't in a hurry. He was enjoying the effect he was having. He was the conductor of this orchestra of terror. Francis nervously closed the door behind him, and the quiet click of the lock sounded like a gunshot, cutting them off from the rest of the world. Sadie leaned lazily against the doorframe, curiously examining the girls as if choosing a new toy. "Who are they?" Krug's voice was low and calm, devoid of any emotion, which made it even more terrifying. The question was directed at Justin, but his eyes were fixed on the girls. "Dad, they're just friends," Justin stammered, his voice trembling. "They were just leaving." Krug ignored him. He shifted his gaze to Paige. He asked where she was from. Paige, summoning all her courage, defiantly replied that it was none of his business. The corner of Krug's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. He liked her fire. He liked it when the prey fought back. It made the hunt more interesting. Then he turned to Murray. She remained silent, trying to become invisible, to blend in with the wall. But her silence attracted him even more than Paige's defiance. He circled her, examining her from all sides, like a buyer at a slave market. He noticed a silver pendant on a chain around her neck. He reached out and roughly tugged on it, making Murray flinch. He asked what kind of trinket it was. She quietly replied that it was a gift. He let go of the pendant, and it swung coldly against her chest, like a pendulum counting down the last seconds of her normal life. And then his gaze fell on the table, on the car keys. The keychain had the Jeep logo, the same one he'd seen parked outside the motel. He picked up the keys, turning them over in his hand. His mind worked quickly and calculatingly. Their own old sedan was on its last legs and attracted attention. But a local girl's SUV, the perfect cover. The decision was made. "We're going for a ride," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. Paige jumped up, shouting that they weren't going anywhere. Frances was instantly beside her, roughly grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain. Krug walked over to Murray and placed the cold keys in her trembling hand. He told her she would drive. Her car, her wheel. The walk from the motel room door to the car felt like an eternity to Murray. The deserted motel parking lot under a low grey sky looked like a set from a horror movie. No one saw them. No one could help them. Murray got behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely get the key into the ignition. Next to her, in the passenger seat, Krug settled in. His presence was almost physically palpable, like a heavy stone pressing on her chest. Paige was roughly shoved into the back seat. She was wedged between Frances and Sadie, as if in a vice. Justin was put on the other side. He stared out the window with a vacant expression, his face ashen. The car started moving. Murray drove, obeying Krug's short, monosyllabic commands. Right, left, straight. He was leading her away from town, down roads that became increasingly deserted. In the rearview mirror, she could see Paige's face, contorted with terror, and hear Sadie's quiet giggles. Every mile took them further from civilization, from any hope of rescue. The road turned into a narrow forest track. The trees closed in overhead, creating a dark, ominous tunnel. Krug ordered her to drive faster. Murray pressed the gas, though her entire being screamed against it. The car bounced over the ruts. Ahead, in the glow of the headlights, a sharp, blind curve appeared. And at that moment, in a desperate flash of instinct, a plan formed in her mind. A crazy, suicidal plan, but the only one she had. It was now or never. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. She threw a quick glance at Krug. He was looking straight ahead, relaxed, confident in his power, not expecting any tricks from her. Entering the turn, she took a deep breath, then jerked the wheel sharply in the opposite direction and slammed the brake pedal to the floor with all her might. The car skidded. Paige's scream from the back seat was drowned out by the deafening screech of tires. The world became a blur of green and brown. The SUV flew off the road at high speed, smashed through a flimsy wooden guardrail, and plowed head-on into a massive tree. The impact was horrific. The windshield shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. The last thing Murray felt was a searing pain, and then everything plunged into a thick, heavy darkness. Silence. The first thing that returned to Murray was a thick, ringing silence, the kind you only find in the heart of the forest. Then, through the cotton in her ears, sounds began to filter through. The faint hiss of steam from the mangled hood, the rustle of dirt sliding off the windshield, a groan from someone in the back seat. She opened her eyes. The world was upside down and out of focus. Through the spiderweb of cracks in the windshield, she could see tree trunks reaching for the grey sky. It smelled of dust, hot metal, and something sweet, coolant. She turned her head, and a sharp pain shot through her neck. Next to her, slumped against the headrest, was Krug. His eyes were closed, a cut bleeding on his temple. He was unconscious. For one tiny, insane moment, a spark of hope ignited in Murray's chest. Maybe it's over. Maybe he's dead. She looked back. Paige was conscious. Her eyes, huge and dark with terror, met Murray's. Francis was holding his head, cursing quietly through clenched teeth. Sadie seemed almost unharmed, her face twisted with rage. Justin sat staring at a single point, his body rocking back and forth as if trying to soothe his own fear. The hope died as quickly as it was born. Krug opened his eyes. There was no pain or confusion in them, only a cold, boiling rage that was slowly focusing on Murray. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, and that look was more terrifying than any scream, any blow. That look promised her that everything up to this point was just a prelude. The real pain was just beginning. The car doors were wrenched open with a sickening screech. Francis, snarling with anger, brutally dragged Paige outside. She screamed and fought back, but her blows were like those of a kitten. Sadie pulled out Justin, who still offered no resistance, and pushed him toward the trees. Then Krug got out of his seat. He walked around the crumpled hood and yanked open the driver's door. He didn't tell her to get out. He just grabbed her by the hair. The pain was sharp, searing, and it jolted Murray out of her stupor. He yanked her from behind the wheel like a sack and threw her onto the damp, cold ground next to Paige. Small stones and pine needles dug into her cheek. The girls lay on the ground, trembling with fear and cold. The gang stood over them, their dark silhouettes outlined against the darkening sky. Krug ordered Francis to search them. He roughly turned out their pockets, spilling the pathetic contents of their former lives onto the ground. Phones, a little cash, lip gloss, the keys to the lake house. Krug approached. He bent down and picked up one of the phones. He turned it over in his hand, looked at the dark screen, and then, without changing his expression, crushed it under his heel with force. The sound of cracking plastic and glass was deafeningly loud in the forest silence. He did the same with the second one. Any hope of rescue, of one short call, was destroyed along with those small pieces of technology. And at that moment, Paige screamed. Her fear had melted into fury. She screamed that they were bastards, that her father was a district attorney, that he would find them and let them rot in prison. She screamed because it was the only weapon she had left. Every word she spoke was a nail in the lid of her own coffin. But she couldn't stop. Krug slowly turned to her. There was no anger on his face, only cold curiosity. He walked over and crouched in front of her. He told her she had a very brave voice. Too brave for such a little girl. He ran the back of his hand across her cheek, and Paige recoiled as if from the touch of a snake. Her eyes flashed with defiance. She gathered saliva in her mouth and spat directly in his face. The air froze. Even Francis and Sadie stood still, waiting. The spittle slowly trickled down Krug's cheek. He didn't wipe it off. He just looked at Paige, and the smile slowly faded from his face, replaced by an icy indifference. He stood up. He said it was time to teach a lesson about what happens when little girls misbehave. He pulled a knife from his belt. The blade was short and wide, and it glinted dully in the forest twilight. Murray screamed. It wasn't a scream, but an animalistic shriek, full of terror and denial. She begged him to stop, begged him to take the car, the money, anything, just don't touch them. But her voice was just background noise to him, white noise. Paige stopped screaming. She stared at the knife with eyes wide with horror, her breath catching. All her former defiance evaporated, leaving only primal fear. Justin, who had been standing aside all this time, pale and trembling, took a few steps forward. He begged his father to let them go, saying they wouldn't say anything, that it was a mistake. His voice broke. Krug didn't even look at him. He just threw over his shoulder for him to shut up and watch. Watch and learn how real business is done. Francis, smirking, grabbed Paige by the hair, forcing her head back violently. Sadie came from the other side and dug her fingers into her shoulders, pinning her to the ground. Paige was trapped, crucified on the forest floor. Krug approached and knelt beside her. He pressed the cold blade to her throat. He said something quietly to her, something cruel and humiliating. Murray could only see a single tear roll down Paige's cheek. Murray squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. She heard her friend's muffled sob, Sadie's quiet, excited laughter, and a short, sharp movement. And then there was silence. A terrible, unnatural, absolute silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. When Murray forced herself to open her eyes, it was over. Paige lay on the ground. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the grey sky, where the first stars were already beginning to appear. Frances let go of her hair, and her head fell limply to the side. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across her light-colored shirt. Mary's world narrowed to this horrific sight. Her friend, with whom she had been laughing and chatting just an hour ago, was dead. Sadie and Frances, with a businesslike air, as if clearing away trash, dragged the lifeless body aside, toward the bushes. Justin threw up. Krug slowly stood up. He wiped the knife blade on his pant leg and put it away. Then he turned to Mary. She lay on the ground, paralyzed by horror. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt. She wasn't screaming anymore. She felt nothing but an icy numbness. She was next. It wasn't a thought, just a cold, indisputable knowledge. He walked over and stood above her. He said she'd been the quiet one, and maybe she'd be smarter. He grabbed her by the jacket and dragged her deeper into the woods, away from the road, away from the wrecked car, away from her friend's body. She didn't resist. She had no strength left. He threw her onto the damp, decaying leaves. She felt the cold of the earth through the thin fabric of her jeans. He loomed over her, his shadow completely covering her. His face was close, and she saw only emptiness and a cold desire for power in his eyes. He tore off her jacket, then her t-shirt. The cold evening air touched her skin, making her shudder. She closed her eyes, turning away, trying to mentally leave her body, to float far, far away into the calm waters of the lake where she had once been happy, where she swam beside her brother. She heard him unbuckling his belt. She felt his weight, and in that moment, the world for her finally split into before and after. He took her by force, brutally and mercilessly, to the quiet rustle of leaves and under the indifferent gaze of the stars. When it was over, he got up and walked away, zipping up his jeans, leaving her lying on the ground like a broken doll. She didn't move, just stared at the sky, which had now become completely dark. Sadie and Frances stood nearby, smoking and talking quietly. Justin sat on the ground, his head in his hands, rocking back and forth. The pain in Murray's body was nothing compared to the emptiness inside. It seemed that it was all over, that she had nothing left. No strength, no will, no hope. But then, through the haze of despair, her gaze caught on something small, glinting in the faint moonlight. Her silver pendant, a gift from her brother, torn from her neck during the struggle, lay on the ground, just a few steps away. Next to it was a rock, a boulder, large and heavy enough with a sharp edge. And at that moment, she saw that Krug was standing with his back to her. He was looking at the wrecked car, deciding what to do next. This wasn't a chance. It was the shadow of a chance, a tiny, almost invisible spark in the impenetrable darkness, and she clung to it. She lay there, staring at the indifferent stars, and didn't feel the cold of the damp earth. Her body was a foreign, detached mechanism, full of pain, but her mind was somewhere far away, in a quiet, empty room without windows or doors. Everything that mattered had been destroyed. Everything she was had been erased. She heard the muffled voices of her tormentors. They were discussing the car, deciding what to do next. Their words mundane, businesslike. To them, she was now just a problem to be solved. But then, through the haze of despair, her unfocused gaze caught on it. A small piece of silver, glinting dully in the moonlight. Her pendant, her brother's gift. He always said it was her lucky star, that it would help her swim faster than anyone. She looked at it, and for the first time in this endless evening, something stirred inside the empty room of her consciousness. A memory. Warm, bright, painfully happy. Her brother's voice, his laughter. Next to the pendant lay a rock. Dark, smooth, with a chip as sharp as a razor. It lay as if someone had placed it there specifically for her. She saw Krug's back. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, peering into the darkness, apparently trying to figure out where they were. Frances was tinkering under the hood of the wrecked car. Sadie was smoking, leaning against a tree. They were relaxed. They were sure they had broken her, that she was no longer a threat. It wasn't a decision. It was an instinct, an ancient primal instinct for survival, as old as the world itself, that suddenly awoke in the darkest depths of her soul. She began to move, slowly, inch by inch, overcoming the pain that shot through every cell in her body. Every rustle of a leaf under her palm sounded like a gunshot to her. She held her breath, afraid to make the slightest sound. Then her fingers, trembling and dirty, touched the cold, damp surface of the rock. She gripped it. Its weight in her hand was real, solid. It gave her a sliver of confidence. Then she reached for the pendant and clenched it in the same fist. The sharp edge of the silver charm dug into her palm, and that small, sharp pain brought her to her senses, chasing away the last remnants of numbness. She got to her feet. The movement was abrupt, clumsy like a newborn fawn. Sadie saw her first, her eyes widening in surprise, the cigarette falling from her slightly parted lips. She shouted something, but it was too late. Krug turned around, and at that very moment, Mari, putting all her remaining strength, all her pain, rage and grief for her murdered friend into the blow, brought the rock down on his head. There was a dull, wet, sickening sound. Krug staggered, his eyes glazing over with surprise and pain. He didn't fall, but for a moment he lost his balance, his body swaying forward. That moment was enough for her. Without letting go of the rock, she stepped forward, and with her free hand, the one clutching the pendant, she struck him in the shoulder. The sharp edge of the silver, a symbol of brotherly love, became a weapon. It tore through the fabric of his shirt and entered his flesh. Krug's eyes reflected not just anger, but shock that the victim had dared to fight back, dared to cause him pain. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran. She ran without seeing the path, through the thick undergrowth. Branches whipped her face and arms, leaving burning scratches. Her feet got tangled in clinging roots, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she heard Krug's furious, pain-filled shouts, his orders to catch her. She heard the crackling of branches under the feet of her pursuers. She knew they were close, that she had only a few seconds, and suddenly, the trees parted. Before her, a few dozen yards away, lay the lake. Her lake. The water, darkened by the night, as black as ink, seemed both a salvation and a curse. The place where she lost her brother had now become her only hope. She didn't slow down. She ran onto a small sandy beach and, without stopping, threw herself into the water. The icy cold seared her body, momentarily taking her breath away. But it was this very feeling that finally brought her to her senses, washing away some of the pain and terror. She swam. Her body, remembering thousands of hours of training, acted almost on autopilot. Stroke, breath, stroke. Her muscles burned, but they worked. She swam toward the opposite shore, where the familiar silhouette of their lake house was faintly visible in the darkness. There were lights on. Mom and Dad were there. She heard shouts from the shore, but they were growing more distant, distorted over the water's surface. A fragile, desperate hope flared in her chest. She could make it. She would make it. Suddenly, a deafening crack tore through the evening silence. The sound of a shotgun blast rolled across the water, hitting the rocks on the other shore and returning as a distorted echo. And at the same instant, a sharp, burning pain shot through her back, just below the shoulder blade. Her body convulsed. Her arms and legs stopped obeying her. Her stroke became weak, clumsy. She choked, swallowing a mouthful of cold, murky water. She tried to swim on, to fight, but her strength was rapidly leaving her. The water was no longer a salvation. It was becoming a grave, heavy and dark, pulling her down to the bottom. She could see the lights of her home on the other shore, so close and yet so unreachable. It was the last thing she saw. The light faded. Her eyes closed, and like a wounded bird, she sank into the cold, silent darkness. Krug lowered the shotgun. Smoke from the shot rose in a thin, ghostly wisp into the still night air. He stared at the water, where his last problem had just disappeared. There was nothing on the surface of the lake. No ripples, no bubbles, no sign of a struggle. Just smooth, black water reflecting the cold stars. He was satisfied. The job was done cleanly. The last witness was at the bottom, where she might never be found. But his satisfaction was short-lived. A single, cold, heavy drop of rain fell from the sky. Then another. A distant, muffled rumble of thunder confirmed what was already obvious. A storm was coming. Francis, casting a nervous glance at the sky, tried again to start the wrecked jeep. The key in the ignition turned with a sickening grind. The engine sputtered, coughed like a dying old man, and stalled. The second attempt didn't even yield that. The car was dead. Its heart, pierced by a tree trunk, had stopped for good. They were trapped. In the middle of the woods, in a stranger's wrecked car, with a girl's body in the bushes and a downpour imminent. Sadie started to panic. Her usual predatory confidence evaporated, replaced by a high, shrieking fear. She blamed Krug for ruining everything. that they should have just taken the car and left. Francis joined in, cursing the car, the girl, and this damned forest. Only Justin was silent. He sat on the wet ground, hugging his knees, and stared at the lake with an expression of absolute, stony emptiness. He had seen Mari swim. He had seen his father shoot, and something inside him, some last thin thread connecting him to this man, snapped. Krug ignored the hysteria. He was the leader. His mind, accustomed to surviving within prison walls, was already working on a solution. Panic was for the weak. He scanned the wall of trees, looking for any landmark, any sign of civilization, and he found it. Through the thick branches, on the opposite shore of the lake, far, far away, a single light flickered. A warm, yellow, inviting light in a window. Shelter. The only shelter for miles around. The girls' lake house. He smirked. The irony. He ordered everyone to shut up. He said they were going there. At that very moment, in that very house, John Collingwood was on his knees in front of the kitchen sink. He, a surgeon accustomed to working with the finest instruments, was now intently trying to fix a clogged garbage disposal. Next to him on the counter lay his tools, screwdrivers, pliers, a hammer, arranged with almost surgical precision. Emma watched him, leaning against the doorframe. The lake house was warm and cozy. It smelled of wood, old books, and something vaguely of home. They barely spoke, but they didn't need words. Their silence was filled with years of shared life. However, beneath this familiar closeness, anxiety simmered. Mari should have been back long ago. Emma went to the window and peered down the dark driveway that disappeared into the woods. Empty. She said she was starting to worry. John, without looking up from his work, tried to reassure her. He said Paige had probably talked Mari's ear off, and they simply lost track of time. But his voice lacked complete conviction. He too felt a cold, sticky unease crawling up his spine. Emma moved away from the window and started going through some old boxes they had brought with them. In one of them, among children's toys and photographs, she found an old baby monitor, 2 small plastic devices, a receiver and a transmitter. She remembered how they used to place it by their son's crib, listening to his breathing at night. The memory stung her heart. She took the receiver, wiped the dust off it, and plugged it into an outlet in the kitchen. The device hissed, emitting only white noise and occasional crackles. She left it on, just because. An unconscious attempt to hear something in the deafening silence of her grief. It was at that moment that the first heavy drops of rain began to drum on the roof. The wind howled in the chimney. The storm had begun. Outside, the world turned into a chaos of water and wind, but inside the house, it was still calm and safe. John finally fixed the disposal. He triumphantly flipped the switch, and the sink responded with a satisfied gurgle. He stood up, wiping his hands, and smiled at Emma. For one brief moment, everything was almost as it used to be. And then there was a knock at the door. The knock was sharp, insistent, almost desperate. It cut through the roar of the downpour and the howling wind. John and Emma froze, exchanging glances. Who could it be? In this weather, in the middle of nowhere. None of their neighbors lived this close, and they weren't expecting anyone. The knock came again, this time louder, more demanding. Something about the sound sent a chill down Emma's spine. John frowned, and slowly, reluctantly, walked to the door. John approached the door, each step on the old, creaking floorboards, echoing in the tense silence of the house. He pressed his eye to the peephole. The world outside was a distorted, watery picture. The downpour turned the porch into a churning stream, and through the murky, rain-streaked glass, he could only make out dark, huddled silhouettes. 3, maybe 4 figures, shrouded in rain and darkness. He couldn't make out their faces or clothes, but their very stillness, their desperate waiting under the relentless torrent of water, was unsettling. He pulled away from the peephole and turned to Emma. His face was a mixture of doubt and concern. She came over and looked through the peephole herself, trying to see what he couldn't. The anxiety wouldn't leave her. This was wrong. Everything about this situation felt wrong. "Who is it?" she whispered, though she knew he couldn't answer. From the other side of the door, a voice called out. Male, hoarse, but surprisingly polite, even a little apologetic. It was Krug's voice. He said they'd been in an accident nearby, on a forest road, that their car had broken down, and one of them was injured. He asked for help, pleaded for them to let them in, at least for a while, until the terrible storm passed. His words were full of desperation. but there was no hint of a threat. It was a perfectly played role of a victim of circumstance. The doctor's instinct in John overrode his instinct for self-preservation. He had spent his life helping people. To refuse aid to an injured person, to leave them to die in the freezing rain, it went against everything he believed in. He looked at Emma, seeking support in her eyes. She hesitated. Her woman's intuition was screaming danger. But what could they do? Leave them out there? What if it was true? What if there really was an injured person who would die because of their fear? She swallowed and gave a barely perceptible nod. John took a deep breath, pushing away his last doubts, and turned the lock. The heavy oak door creaked open. 4 people stood on the threshold. The first was Krug. Water streamed from his hair and clothes. He was clutching his shoulder, and a dark patch of blood was seeping through his wet shirt. His face was a grimace of pain mixed with respectful gratitude. Behind him, like wet crows, stood Francis, nervously glancing around, Sadie, trying to muster a pathetic, frozen smile, and Justin, who avoided eye contact, staring at his feet. He looked like a ghost. They looked exactly as people in trouble should look, miserable, soaked and scared. Krug spoke again, apologizing for the intrusion. He introduced himself, and briefly but convincingly recounted a fabricated story about a deer jumping onto the road, a skid, and the car flying into a ditch. The story sounded plausible. John and Emma, stepping aside, let them into the house. The atmosphere changed instantly. The quiet, cozy lake house, their fortress, was filled with strangers who brought with them the cold, the smell of wet clothes, damp earth, and a subtle but palpable tension. Emma, overcoming her initial shock, hurried to get towels. John, as a doctor, immediately turned his attention to Krug's wound. He told him he needed to examine the shoulder. Krug sat down at the large kitchen table, in the very spot where Murray should have been sitting just a few hours ago. When he pulled off his wet shirt, a map of crude prison tattoos was revealed on his body. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed John's eyes, but he dismissed it. This was a patient. He brought the first aid kit and began to clean the wound. It was not deep, but it was ragged and dirty. John worked professionally and detachedly, asking questions about how it happened. Krug lied easily and naturally, telling a story about a branch that had pierced his shoulder in the crash. Emma handed towels to the others and offered them hot tea. Francis and Sadie accepted with greedy gratitude, but their eyes darted around the house with unconcealed curiosity. They scanned the photos on the walls, the bookshelves, the antique furniture. They were appraising. Justin took a towel but didn't touch the tea. He sat in the darkest corner of the living room, on a chair by the fireplace, and tried to become invisible. His silence and detachment were strange, but Emma attributed it to shock from the accident. The conversation at the kitchen table was strained. John finished the bandaging. Emma placed steaming mugs of tea on the table. Krug thanked them, showering them with compliments about their home and their hospitality. He talked about how lucky they were to have stumbled upon their house, upon such kind people. He acted confident, almost charming, but something in his gaze made Emma uneasy. It was the look of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted without asking permission. She asked if they had children. The question was innocent, an attempt to make small talk, but for her it was filled with pain. Krug smirked and said he had a stepson, nodding towards Justin. He said the boy was a little out of it after the accident. Then his gaze fell on a photo of Mari and her brother on the mantelpiece. He asked if they were their children. Emma nodded, and her voice trembled as she said they had a daughter and a son. The word "had" hung in the air, heavy and cold. She explained that their son had died. For a moment, silence descended on the room, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof. Krug feigned sympathy, saying it was terrible, but his eyes remained cold and empty. He felt nothing. Justin, hearing the conversation about children, looked up. His eyes met Emma's. There was such unspoken torment in his eyes, such desperation, that her heart clenched. She couldn't understand the source of his pain, but she felt it. He quickly looked away, staring at the floor again. The rain outside did not let up, turning into a monotonous, endless curtain. It became clear that the guests were stuck here for a long time, perhaps until morning. Emma, sighing, offered them the guest room for the night. Krug gratefully accepted. The situation seemed to have normalized. 2 families, brought together by chance and bad weather. But beneath this deceptive surface, a sense of impending doom was slowly growing. Emma felt it in every cell of her body. She looked at these people sitting at her table, drinking her tea, and couldn't shake the feeling that something dark, ancient and very dangerous, had entered her home, her quiet, safe harbor. Emma led them upstairs. The staircase creaked quietly under their steps. She felt like a jailer leading prisoners to their cell, though in reality it was the other way around. She was the mistress of the house, but she felt alien and vulnerable. She opened the door to the guest room. It was a bright, cozy room with a large window overlooking the lake. A room where their friends used to stay, always filled with laughter. Now, these dark, silent people were entering it. She showed them the bathroom, got clean sheets and a stack of fresh towels from the closet. Sadie and Francis acted like tourists in a fancy hotel they'd gotten for free. They touched the furniture, peeked into the closet, whispering comments to each other. Krug stayed in the shadows by the door, his eyes following Emma's every move. She felt his gaze on her back, heavy and appraising, and it made her skin crawl. Justin entered the room last and immediately sat on the floor in a corner, as far away from the others as possible, hugging his knees. He looked more like a prisoner than a family member. Emma wished them a good night, trying to keep her voice from trembling, and quickly left, closing the door firmly behind her. For a moment, she leaned against it, against the cool, hard wood, closing her eyes and trying to calm her racing heart. The silence in the second-floor hallway felt as fragile as glass. She could hear her own every breath, every pulse in her ears. It felt as though the very presence of these people one floor above was poisoning the air in her home, filling it with an invisible venom. She went downstairs. John was clearing the table, wiping away the rings from the wet mugs. His movements were methodical, calm, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. She went to him and quietly, so as not to be heard upstairs, shared her fears. She said these people scared her, that there was something predatory, wrong about their leader, that his stepson looked like a hostage, not a child. John listened to her and then tried to calm her down. He said she was just tired and overthinking things, that their own anxiety about Marie was making them see danger where there was none. He found logical explanations for everything. They had been in an accident. They were in shock, hence their strange behavior. His rationality, his calm doctor's analysis, seemed foreign and inappropriate to her now. She was feeling, not thinking, and her instincts were screaming of mortal danger. But she didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just paranoia. While they were quietly arguing in the kitchen, upstairs in the guest room, Justin sat in his corner, his world collapsing. He didn't hear the rain, didn't see the shabby surroundings. He saw Paige's face in that last moment. He heard Marie's scream as his father dragged her into the woods. He heard the shot over the lake. These images were burned into his mind. He was an accomplice. His silence, his fear, had made him just like them. He had to do something, anything. He took a small, worn notebook and a pencil stub, which he always carried, from his back pocket. Drawing was his only way of speaking when words got stuck in his throat. With trembling hands he began to draw. He didn't think about composition or detail. His hand moved on its own. On the paper, a house appeared, the dark water of the lake, and a small, lonely figure of a girl swimming in the water. It was a quick, schematic sketch, a cry for help encrypted in lines and shadows, but that wasn't enough. He needed proof, something tangible, and he remembered. The pendant. He had seen his father pick it up from the shore after the shot and stuff it into the pocket of his wet jacket. That jacket was now drying on the back of a chair by the window. Krug, Francis and Sadie were talking quietly, deciding what to do in the morning. They paid no attention to him. He was invisible to them. His heart pounded in his chest so hard it felt like it could be heard throughout the room. Justin slowly, trying not to make a sound, stood up. He pretended to look out the window at the storm. He approached the chair. His hand, like a snake, slipped into the jacket pocket. His fingers found the cold, wet metal. He clenched the pendant in his fist. No one noticed anything. Now he had to pass it on. He slipped quietly out of the room. The hallway was empty. He held his breath, listening. Downstairs, the parents' voices had fallen silent. They must have gone to their bedroom. On tiptoe, fearing the creak of every floorboard, he went down the stairs. The house was submerged in semi-darkness. Only a light in the kitchen was on. He snuck in there. His heart was about to leap out of his chest. He approached the large kitchen table, the very heart of this house, this stranger's family paradise that his father had destroyed. For a moment, he froze, unsure what to do. Leave a note? But what would he write? Call them? But he was terrified of his father. He simply placed his drawing in the most conspicuous spot, and next to it, on the white sheet of paper, he left the silver pendant. 2 pieces of evidence, 2 silent witnesses. He hoped they would see, that they would understand. Then, like a ghost, he slipped out of the kitchen just as quietly and returned to his room, to his prison. Silence fell over the house again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Tense, ringing, like a taut string. Downstairs on the kitchen table lay the truth, a time bomb waiting to go off. The storm began to subside. The furious downpour was replaced by a quiet, monotonous patter of rain. The thunder had moved far away, beyond the hills, and now only grumbled occasionally, like a disturbed old dog. Emma lay in bed, sleepless. She stared at the ceiling, where shadows from the swaying branches outside danced. Beside her, John breathed evenly and deeply. He had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the long drive and the anxiety. But Emma couldn't sleep. Her consciousness was stretched taut like a string. Every sound in the house seemed threatening. The creak of a floorboard, the tap of a raindrop on the windowsill, the howl of the wind in the chimney. She tried to convince herself that John was right, that it was just paranoia born of stress. But her body knew the truth. Her instincts screamed of danger. She replayed the evening's events in her mind over and over. Justin's frightened eyes, Krug's prison tattoos, their all-too-smooth rehearsed story, and Mari's pendant. Why had she taken it off? She never took it off. The anxiety became almost physically unbearable, like a wave of nausea. She couldn't lie still any longer. She needed to move, to do something. She got up, careful not to wake John, and tiptoed out of the bedroom. The house was dark and quiet. She decided to get a drink of water. Barefoot on the cold wooden floors, she went down to the kitchen. She didn't turn on the overhead light, not wanting to attract attention. Only a small lamp above the stove was on, its dim yellow light pulling the kitchen table, the sink, the chairs out of the darkness. She poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, staring into the black window that reflected her own pale, anxious face. She put the glass down and was about to leave when her gaze caught on something on the table. 2 white spots in the semi-darkness, a piece of paper and something small, glittering next to it. She moved closer, first with bewilderment, then with a growing, soul-chilling horror. She picked up the folded piece of paper. It was a drawing, clumsy, childlike, but unmistakably clear. A house, a lake, and a girl swimming in the water. There was nothing scary about it, but the sheer strangeness of the find made her heart beat faster. The drawing from that silent, frightened boy, Justin. Why did he leave it here? And then her eyes fell on the pendant. She reached out, her fingers trembling. She touched the cold silver, then picked it up. She didn't need to examine it. She knew it by touch. Her fingers remembered every curve, every swirl of the small charm. It was the gift she and John had given Mari for her 16th birthday. She had worn it without taking it off since that day. In that moment, Emma's world collapsed. The air ran out. Time stopped. All the pieces of the puzzle, her anxiety, the guest's strange behavior, the wound on Krug's shoulder that wasn't from a branch, Justin's terrified eyes, Mari's absence, and this pendant here in her kitchen, snapped together into one monstrous, unbearable picture. She clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. The scream was tearing its way out, but she muffled it, suppressed it, because she knew a noise could get them all killed. Her legs gave way, and she leaned on the table to keep from falling. She understood. These people sleeping upstairs in her guest room were not accident victims. They were monsters, and they had done something to her daughter. At that very moment, John, awakened by the cold of the empty bed, came downstairs. He saw his wife standing in the middle of the kitchen, doubled over, pale as death. He saw what she was clutching in her hand. He saw the drawing on the table. He didn't ask anything. He understood everything from her eyes, which reflected all of hell. And in that same instant, from outside, from the direction of the lake, came a sound, a faint, barely audible groan. Or was it their imagination? A trick of a mind stretched to its limit. John rushed to the back door that led to the porch. He threw it open. The sound of the rain had almost ceased, leaving only a quiet, melancholic dripping. He stepped out onto the wet porch boards, peering into the pre-dawn gloom. And he saw her. At the very edge of their dock, at the verge of the dark, still water, lay a figure. It was covered in mud and grime. It was barely moving, but it was moving. John grabbed a flashlight that stood by the door and aimed the beam in that direction. The light snatched from the darkness a tangle of wet hair, torn clothes, and a familiar, unrecognizably ravaged face. It was Murray, alive. Barely alive, but breathing. She had crawled out of the water. She had crawled home. John sprinted towards her, oblivious to the cold, wet dockboards under his bare feet. The world narrowed to this small, broken figure lying by the water. He leapt over the steps leading from the porch, and in seconds was beside her, dropping to his knees. Emma, paralyzed by shock for only a moment, ran after him, her mind refusing to believe what her eyes were seeing. When John reached Mari, his heart stopped. It was her, but at the same time, not her. Her clothes were torn and soaked with water, blood, and swamp muck. Her face was one large bruise, covered in dirt, her lips blue from the cold, but her eyes were open. They looked at him, and in their depths was an abyss of pain, terror, and recognition. She was home. She was with her father. She tried to say something, but only a weak, gurgling rasp escaped her throat. John, as a doctor, instantly, almost automatically assessed her condition. Severe shock, critical hypothermia, multiple injuries, and then he saw it. As he tried to lift her to get her out of the icy water, he saw on her back, under her shoulder blade, the entry wound from a shotgun pellet. The blood had soaked through the fabric. He knew that every second counted. "Emma, first aid kit, blankets, anything warm, quick!" His voice was firm, commanding, like in an operating room. There was no room for panic, only the icy concentration of a professional facing death. Emma, hearing the command, snapped out of her stupor. She turned and ran into the house as fast as she could. And John, carefully, trying not to cause more pain, scooped his daughter into his arms. She was almost weightless, as fragile as an autumn leaf. He carried her into the house, into the only safe place. Emma was already rushing towards them with a pile of blankets and the large plastic first aid kit. They brought Murray into the living room and laid her on the couch, away from the windows that could become a line of fire. John cut away her wet, cold clothes with scissors from the kit. Emma wrapped her in warm, dry blankets, trying to warm her shivering body. Every touch was torture for Murray, but she endured it, looking at her parents. Her gaze darted from her father's face to her mother's. It held not only fear, but a desperate, silent warning. John worked quickly and with focus. He examined the wound. The pellet, thankfully, had gone straight through, but it had damaged a lung. He could hear the characteristic rattling with each of her shallow, convulsive breaths. She needed immediate surgery, a hospital, which was dozens of miles away on washed-out night roads. "Call 911. John rushed to the landline on the wall. No dial tone. The line was dead, most likely from the storm. He grabbed his cell phone. No service. They were trapped. They were cut off from the world. In the same house as their dying daughter and her tormentors, who were sleeping right above their heads. "They're upstairs," Murray whispered, the effort immense. Her eyes widened, horror swimming in them. "We know, sweetie." "We know," Emma answered, stroking her wet hair, holding back the sobs that were tearing through her. "Shh, don't talk. Save your strength. We're here." John stood up. His face had become a stone mask. The surgeon's gaze, accustomed to the sight of blood and suffering, was replaced by something primal, dark. He looked at Emma. All their doubts, all their civility, all their faith in goodness and order evaporated in that moment. Only one simple animalistic truth remained. Monsters who had tried to kill their child were sleeping in their house, and there was no help to be expected from anywhere. "What are we going to do?" Emma whispered, though she already knew the answer. Her voice trembled, but notes of steel were already creeping in. John didn't answer right away. He slowly walked to the fireplace and picked up the heavy cast-iron poker. He turned it over, feeling the cold weight of the metal in his palm. It fit perfectly in his hand, like a scalpel, only for a different kind of work. Then he looked at his wife. The doctor was gone from his eyes. In his eyes was a father, a husband, a protector, and in them was a resolve, as cold and hard as steel. "They are not leaving this house," he said quietly, but each word sounded like a death sentence. Emma nodded. Her fear hadn't vanished. It beat in her chest like a frightened bird. But now, beneath it, a solid granite foundation of rage had formed. She looked at her daughter, fighting for every breath on the couch. She looked at her husband with the poker in his hand, and she knew this night wasn't over. The worst was just beginning. They were no longer victims. They were becoming hunters. Their plan became revenge. Simple, brutal, and inevitable. They couldn't save their daughter by getting her out of the house, because then the monsters would wake up and finish what they had started. The only way to give Murray a chance was to eliminate the threat, one by one, quietly, quickly, and ruthlessly. They exchanged a look. No more words were needed. John gestured for Emma to stay with Murray, while he, clutching the poker, began to move slowly and silently like a predator up the stairs to the second floor. Each step on the old wooden stairs echoed the heavy beat of his heart. Climbing the stairs, John moved with extreme, almost superhuman caution. He became all hearing, all sight, a single, coiled spring of tension. He stepped on the very edges of the stairs, where the old wood creaked the least, shifting his weight smoothly, like a dancer. The poker in his hand felt both alien, a barbarian's tool, and a natural extension of his rage, a surgical instrument for a very dirty operation. He wasn't thinking about morality, about consequences. He was acting. His entire life, all his principles, all his belief in humanism, had been reduced to one simple, primal task: protect the den and what was left of his pack. Upstairs, silence reigned, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain and a barely audible, intermittent snore from behind the guest room door. The door was ajar by a few inches, a thin strip of light from the hallway seeping through the gap. John, holding his breath, peered inside. In the dim light filtering through the window, he made out sleeping bodies. Krug, covered with a blanket, was sleeping on the large bed. Next to him, with her back to him, lay Sadie. Justin, as before, was in the armchair in the corner, but his head was thrown back. He too was asleep. And Francis, apparently unable to find a spot in the room, had settled on a cot in the hallway, just a few feet away from him. This was his first target, the first beast to be put down, separated from the pack, vulnerable. John stepped back from the door, pressing his back against the wall, catching his breath. He looked down at Emma. She stood at the foot of the stairs like a sentry. Her face was pale in the semi-darkness, but resolute. In her hands, she clutched the hammer John had used to fix the sink. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they gave each other strength, a tacit permission for what was about to happen. He approached the sleeping Francis again. He lay on his back, arms flung wide, his mouth slightly open, his breathing even and deep. He was defenseless. For one fleeting, treacherous moment, the thought of the Hippocratic oath flashed through John's mind. Do no harm. He had saved people his entire life, and now he was about to take a life. But then he saw his daughter's face on the couch again, her wound, her pain, and the doubts burned away in the fire of his rage. This was not a person. This was a monster that had invaded his home and tried to devour his child. He raised the poker. The muscles in his arms tensed. He aimed for the head, the temple, counting on one quick, quiet, and fatal blow. But at the very last moment, in the split second when the metal was already flying towards its target, Francis twitched in his sleep, mumbled something, and turned onto his side. The blow that should have been lethal landed on his shoulder. There was a dull, wet sound of bone breaking and a choked cry of pain and surprise. Francis woke up instantly, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't understand what was happening, but instinct worked faster than reason. He roared and leaped up, knocking over the cot, and threw himself at the dark figure looming over him. A desperate, animalistic struggle began. They wrestled in the narrow hallway, raining blows on each other. Francis was younger and stronger, his movements sharp and furious, like a cornered beast. John, though in good shape, was no match for him in raw strength, but his rage gave him desperate power. The poker flew from his hands and clattered away. The noise of the fight was deafening. It woke everyone up. The guest room door burst open. Sadie appeared on the threshold, sleepy and confused, her hair disheveled. Behind her came Krug, who, unlike her, assessed the situation instantly. His eyes narrowed, his face showing no surprise, only cold, calculating anger. Emma, hearing the commotion upstairs, rushed to help. She ran up the stairs with the hammer in her hand, taking the steps two at a time. She saw Francis choking her husband, straddling him. Without a second's hesitation, she ran up and hit Francis on the back with the hammer with all her might. He howled in pain and turned around, his face contorted with rage. He let go of John and lunged at her. John scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. He saw Francis shove Emma against the wall. At that moment, Krug and Sadie were already running out of the room. There was no time to think. John grabbed Francis by the neck and, using the element of surprise, putting all his fury into the motion, dragged him towards the stairs. They tumbled down together, a rolling, chaotic mass. The crash of their fall was deafening. Downstairs in the living room they separated. John hit his head on the banister, and for a moment his vision went dark. Francis was the first to get up. He was injured, but still dangerous. He saw Murray lying on the couch. A vicious, sadistic light gleamed in his eyes. He took a step towards her, intending to finish what he had started. But John had already recovered. He threw himself in Francis's path, and they locked in a brutal struggle once more. They fought for life and death in the middle of their own living room, overturning furniture, breaking lamps. Emma, recovering from the blow, ran downstairs and joined her husband. She hit Francis with whatever came to hand: a vase, a heavy hardcover book, a picture frame. The three of them managed to wrestle him to the ground. John sat on his chest, pinning him down. Emma held his arms. Francis gasped, trying to break free, his eyes bloodshot. He was neutralized, but still alive, still a threat. From upstairs came Sadie's scream, calling for Krug. They were coming down. John and Emma exchanged a look. They had to finish this, quickly. John looked at the kitchen table, where his set of tools for fixing the sink still lay. And a terrible, but in this situation, only correct plan was born. He yelled at Emma to hold him tight, no matter what. Then he jumped up and ran to the kitchen. While John ran to the kitchen, Emma held Francis down with all her might. He writhed beneath her like a huge, powerful snake, his muscles hard as stone. He hissed threats, promising that Krug would do to them what he did to their daughter, only slower. Every word he spoke was poison, but it also fueled the fire of her rage. She pressed her knee into his chest, putting into the movement all the pain and desperation of a mother whose child had been hurt. Sadie was already running down the stairs. She stopped halfway, seeing what was happening below. Her sleepy face twisted in fury. She screamed and rushed down, but not to help Francis. Her gaze, full of predatory malice, was fixed on the couch. She saw Murray, lying defenseless under the blankets. An easy target, a perfect way to inflict maximum pain. John returned from the kitchen. His face was like the mask of a Greek god of vengeance. In his hand was not a knife or an axe. In his hand was a hammer and a long, thin crowbar from his toolkit. He saw Sadie running towards his daughter. "Emma! Sadie!" he yelled, his voice almost unrecognizable. Emma turned. She saw the danger, and without thinking, let go of Francis, lunging to intercept Sadie. The two women collided with the fury of furies. Emma was driven by primal maternal instinct, Sadie by pure, unadulterated malice. They grappled, rolling on the floor, pulling each other's hair, landing short, fierce blows. Francis, now free, tried to get up, but John was already there. He threw his full weight on him, pinning him to the floor again. Francis hadn't expected this. He thought this quiet, nerdy doctor would break, but he was wrong. There was a cold, surgical fury in John's eyes. He was on his home turf, in his operating room. "Keep his head straight," he ordered, as if to an assistant in surgery. Francis didn't understand. John didn't wait. He placed the sharp, curved end of the crowbar on Francis's arm, on the spot on his wrist, where the radial artery pulsed distinctly under the skin. Then he raised the hammer. Francis finally realized what was about to happen, and his eyes widened in animal terror. He screamed, trying to pull his arm free, but John held him tight, as if in a vice. There was a horrific, dull sound, and Francis's arm went limp. Dark red blood quickly spread across the floor, and his body began to weaken. He stared at his arm in horror and disbelief, his strength draining away with every second. Meanwhile, Emma and Sadie's fight had moved to the back door leading to the porch. Emma was smaller, but more desperate. She managed to push Sadie away, and she, losing her balance, stumbled outside onto the wet porch. Emma rushed out after her and slammed the door, cutting her off from the house. But Sadie wasn't giving up. She jumped up and started trying to break back in, pounding on the glass panel in the door with her fists and feet. Emma held the door from the inside. She could see Sadie's face, contorted with rage through the glass, could hear her muffled curses, and then her gaze fell on the kitchen counter, where the garbage disposal was still on. The same one John had fixed just a few hours ago, in another, peaceful, now impossible life. A plan formed in her head, as horrific and inevitable as her husband's. She let go of the door. Sadie, not expecting this, yanked it open forcefully and stumbled into the kitchen. slipping on the wet floor. Emma was waiting for her. She grabbed Sadie by the hair and with inhuman strength dragged her to the sink. Sadie fought back desperately, scratching, biting, but Emma, blinded by rage, felt no pain. She could only see her daughter's face, her wound, her suffering. She dragged Sadie to the sink and forcefully bent her over it. She turned on the water and then, fumbling for the switch on the wall, flipped it. The low, predatory whir of the disposal filled the air. Emma grabbed Sadie's right hand and shoved it into the drain. A monstrous mechanical grinding sound drowned out Sadie's scream, and then Justin appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had come downstairs, drawn by the noise. He froze on the threshold, his face a mask of horror. He saw Emma holding Sadie, her body convulsing in agony. He met Emma's gaze for a moment, and in her eyes he saw not madness, but the same pain that was in him. He stepped forward, grabbed a heavy cast-iron coal shovel that stood by the fireplace, and without thinking, hit Sadie over the head with all his might. Again and again. The scream stopped. Emma let her go. Sadie's body went limp and slid to the floor. The disposal continued to run, its humming the only sound in the blood-splattered kitchen. In the living room, Francis was no longer moving. He lay in a huge, rapidly growing pool of his own blood, his eyes open and empty. John stood over him, breathing heavily. He looked at his hands, at the hammer, at the crowbar. He didn't recognize himself. And at that moment, from the top of the stairs, came a slow, mocking clap. John, Emma, and Justin all turned at once. On the top step stood Krug. He had been watching the whole time. There was no fear or surprise on his face, only a cold, predatory interest. He had watched this bloody performance to the end, and now it was his turn. The slow, measured claps echoed through the dead house. The sound was so out of place, so monstrously absurd in the midst of this carnage, that for a moment it paralyzed all three of them. It was the sound used to greet good actors on a stage, a sound of approval, of recognition, and that made it all the more terrifying. John, Emma, and Justin all raised their heads at the same time. On the top landing of the stairs, leaning against the railing, stood Krug. He was in no hurry. He didn't look scared or even angry. He looked interested, like a Roman emperor gazing down at an arena where gladiators had just torn lions apart. He looked at Francis's body, bleeding out on the carpet, at Sadie's lifeless doll on the kitchen floor, at the three blood-splattered people who had turned into killers, and on his face was a crooked, approving smirk. He stopped clapping. The silence that followed was deafening, as heavy as a tombstone. "Impressive," he said. His voice was calm, almost lazy, as if he were commenting on the weather. "Honestly, I didn't expect this from you, from such civilized people." He took a step down, then another. He descended not like a man charging into an attack, but like a master descending into his domain to restore order. "It turns out that under all this pretense," he gestured around the living room, "under the nice house, the right life, the polite smiles, you're just like me." He stopped halfway down the stairs and looked directly into John's eyes. "Maybe even worse. Because you've been lying to yourselves your whole lives, pretending to be something else. But I always knew who I was." Every word he spoke was poison, a psychological attack aimed at breaking their spirits before breaking their bodies. John gripped the hammer in his hand, his knuckles turning white. Emma was breathing heavily, her gaze darting from Krug to Murray, who was trembling slightly under the blankets. Justin was frozen, pressed against the wall, the cast-iron shovel having fallen from his weakened hands. He looked at his father with a new, previously unknown feeling, not fear, but a cold, quiet hatred. "Now," Krug continued, descending another step, "you'll have to deal with me, and I promise, it won't be as easy as it was with those two idiots." He savored their fear, their exhaustion. He fed on it. He was confident of his victory, of his physical and moral superiority. And at that moment, behind him, in the dark doorway of the guest room, a pale shadow appeared. It was Justin. Not the Justin standing downstairs, but the one upstairs, who had made his decision. He had quietly left the room while his father was absorbed in his game. Krug didn't see him. He was completely focused on his new prey. Justin looked down at the scene of carnage, at John and Emma, at the girl on the couch. There was no fear in his eyes, only the quiet, cold resolve of a person with nothing left to lose. He did the only thing he could. He raised his hand, and something jangled in it. It was the key to their motorboat. He threw it down. It flew through the air and landed with a clatter on the wooden floor near Emma's feet. The jingle of metal made Krug turn sharply. He saw his stepson. He saw the key on the floor. He saw everything. And his mask of calm superiority cracked, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Pure, unadulterated rage contorted his face. Betrayal, the one thing he could not forgive. He roared, and it was no longer a human voice but the roar of a beast. He forgot about John and Emma. He lunged back up the stairs towards his stepson. "Run!" John yelled at Emma. This was their chance. While Krug dealt with Justin, they had a few precious seconds. Emma scrambled for the key, grabbing it. John took up a position at the foot of the stairs, ready to meet Krug when he came down. But Krug didn't waste time on his stepson. He just threw him forcefully into the room so that he hit the wall and slid to the floor, and immediately turned back. He flew down the stairs, taking them two at a time, huge and unstoppable like an avalanche. John held the hammer out in front of him like a shield. Krug crashed into him with full force. The impact was so great that John was thrown several feet and slammed into the wall. The hammer fell from his weakened hands. Krug was on him, his huge hands closing around John's throat, lifting him into the air. John's feet left the floor. He gasped, scratching at the steel fingers, trying to break the death grip. Emma, seeing this, froze in horror for a moment. But then, she heard a faint moan from the couch. Mari. She couldn't leave John, but she couldn't abandon her daughter either. She made a choice. She ran to the couch, threw back the blankets, and tried to lift Mari into her arms. It was almost impossible. Mari wasn't just injured, she was like a broken doll, her body limp and unresponsive. Emma, straining with all her might, sobbing with desperation and helplessness, hoisted her daughter over her shoulder. Pain and desperation gave her superhuman strength. She dragged her towards the back door, towards the lake, towards the salvation that the boy who had just betrayed his father had given them. Behind her, she heard the sounds of dull thuds and furious gasps. John was still alive. He was still fighting. And she had to make sure his sacrifice was not in vain. Every step for Emma was torture. Mari wasn't just heavy. She was a limp, dead weight of someone else's grief. Emma could feel her daughter's warm blood soaking through the blanket and staining her own clothes. She heard Mari's weak, intermittent breathing by her ear, like the rustle of dry leaves. This sound, this fragile, precious sign of life, was the only thing that kept her moving, putting one leaden foot in front of the other. She made it out to the porch. The night air was cold and damp after the rain. Water mixed with Sadie's blood sloshed under her feet, creating a disgusting, sticky mess. She didn't look down. She looked only ahead, at the dark silhouette of the dock and the boat, barely visible rocking on the black water. That was the finish line. That was salvation. Behind her, in the house, the struggle had reached its peak. Krug was a killing machine made of pure rage. He was slamming John's head into the drywall again and again. The plaster crumbled, leaving dents. Crimson stars danced before John's eyes. The world was narrowing to a single point of unbearable pain. He could feel bones crunching, his grip on Krug's arms weakening. Air wasn't reaching his lungs. He was dying. But then, through the fog, he saw the fireplace. Next to it on the floor lay the poker he had dropped at the beginning. It was too far. But next to it stood the set of fireplace tools in a heavy cast-iron stand. A small brush and shovel, useless, and tongs, long iron, with sharp, beak-like ends. Gathering the last of his strength, the last spark of consciousness, John stopped fighting Krug's hands. Instead, he stretched his own arm out to the side, his fingers desperately reaching for the tool stand. They found the cold metal. He gripped the tongs. The movement was clumsy, weak, but enough. He turned them, and without aiming, thrust the point upward, into the face of Krug leaning over him. One of the sharp ends pierced Krug's cheek just below the eye. The pain was sudden, sharp, unexpected. Krug roared, more from surprise than pain, and instinctively loosened his grip. It was enough. John gasped a precious, life-saving breath, and using his freed hands, punched Krug with all his might right in the wound, driving the point of the tongs even deeper. Krug's roar turned into a shriek. He staggered back, clutching his face. Blood poured through his fingers. John rolled to the side, coughing and choking, trying to fill his seared lungs with air. He was alive. He had bought a few seconds. Meanwhile, Emma was already on the dock. The planks were slippery from the rain. She carefully lowered Mari onto the decking, trying not to hurt her. The boat was tied up. Emma's hands were shaking so much that she couldn't immediately untie the tight sailor's knot. The rope was wet and unyielding. Finally, the knot gave way. Now came the hardest part, moving Murray from the dock into the boat. She tried to push her, but the boat moved away from the dock. Emma almost fell into the water. She pulled the boat closer, waded knee-deep into the icy water, and straining every muscle began to haul her daughter over the side. Krug in the house had recovered. Rage washed away the pain. He pulled the tongs from his cheek and threw them against the wall with a roar. A torn, bleeding wound remained on his face, making him look demonic. He looked at John, who was trying to get up, leaning on the couch. He was about to finish him off, but then he heard a splash from outside and Emma's choked cry as she nearly dropped Murray. Krug froze. He understood. They were escaping. His prey was escaping. He turned, paying no more attention to John. Like an enraged bull, he charged for the back door, bursting it open with his shoulder. He ran out onto the porch. He saw them. Emma had almost managed it. Murray was halfway in the boat. A few more seconds, and they would be away. He let out a furious roar and charged towards the dock. John, staggering, got to his feet. He saw Krug rushing towards his wife and daughter. He had no strength left to fight. He was physically broken, but he had to stop him. His mind, working feverishly, searched for a way. He looked around. His gaze fell on the kitchen table, on the microwave oven, and in his inflamed, exhausted brain, a final, most insane and terrible plan was born. He knew what he had to do. He stumbled towards the kitchen as Krug raced towards the lake. Emma heard the roar behind her and turned. The huge, dark figure of Krug was charging down the dock straight at her, like a locomotive. There was no time. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but the sight of her helpless daughter lying in the boat gave her strength. With one last, desperate effort, she heaved Murray completely over the side. Her daughter's body fell with a dull thud onto the bottom of the boat. Without thinking, Emma pushed the boat away from the dock with all the force she could muster. In doing so, she lost her balance and plunged waist-deep into the water. The icy cold seized her, but she paid it no mind. The boat, propelled by her push, began to slowly drift away from the shore, carrying Murray into the saving darkness. Krug reached the end of the dock just as the boat moved a few feet away. He roared in impotent fury. He could have jumped into the water, but in the dark, wounded, he was unlikely to catch them. He turned his anger on the one who was closer. He grabbed Emma, standing in the water by the hair, and with a single jerk, yanked her onto the dock like a wet, heavy net. He hit her. The blow was of terrible force, sending her sprawling onto the planks. Emma's ears rang. The world went dark for a moment. Krug loomed over her, his face contorted by the wound and rage, inches from her own. He hissed that she wasn't going anywhere. He would make her watch as he caught up with her daughter and finished the job. He was going to take everything from her. But at that moment, John's voice came from the house. Calm, almost lifeless but firm. He called Krug's name. Krug slowly turned. John was standing on the porch. He was unarmed. He just stood there and watched. It was a trap, and Krug knew it. But his pride, his confidence in his own superiority, wouldn't let him back down. He didn't just want to kill this man. He wanted to break him. He let go of Emma, and with a smirk, started back towards the house. He told her not to go far. The show was just beginning. Emma, coughing and spitting, crawled to the edge of the dock. She saw Krug walk up the porch steps and enter the house. She saw John retreat inside, luring him in. The door slammed shut. She looked at the lake. The boat with Murray was slowly moving away. She was safe. Now everything depended on John. Emma knew she had to do something. She couldn't just sit and wait. She looked at the second boat, the motorboat, tied to the other end of the dock. If she could start it. In the house, the final battle began. Krug entered the living room like a gladiator into an arena. He expected to see John cowering in a corner, trembling with fear. But John was standing in the middle of the room, and there was no fear in his eyes, only emptiness. "She's gone," John said. "You won't get her." "I'll get you," Krug snarled. "And then I'll find her. And when I do, I'll tell her how her daddy cried before he died." He lunged at John, but John was ready. He didn't try to fight head-on. He dodged, used furniture for cover, forcing Krug to waste time and energy. He tipped a heavy bookshelf onto him. Krug easily threw it aside. He threw a chair at him. Krug caught it and broke it with his bare hands. It was not an equal fight. It was a beating. Krug cornered John in the kitchen. He grabbed him and began to beat him methodically, breaking his ribs. He threw him to the floor. John almost lost consciousness. Krug leaned over him to deliver the final blow. And then John did something Krug never expected. He stopped resisting. He went limp. He whispered, "You're right. I'm just like you." Krug froze. Those words, that admission of defeat, were sweeter to him than any victory. He smirked, his ego satisfied. He loosened his grip, savoring his moment of triumph. And in that instant, John struck. Not with his fist. He grabbed a box of cereal from the table and poured its contents onto the floor. Krug, distracted, slipped on the scattered cereal. He lost his balance for just a split second, but for John, it was enough. He leapt up, grabbed Krug by the head, and with all his remaining inhuman strength, slammed his face into the edge of the kitchen counter. There was a sickening crunch. Krug went limp, his body like a rag doll. He was knocked out. John didn't stop. He knew that someone like Krug would be up in a minute, and it would all start over. He had to finish this, once and for all. He dragged the unconscious body to the microwave oven. He opened the door. With great difficulty, straining every muscle, he shoved Krug's head inside. Then he slammed the door shut, clamping it on his neck. He set the timer to the maximum and pressed the start button. The low, monotonous hum of the microwave filled the kitchen, becoming the only sound in the ruined house. It was steady, indifferent, absurdly domestic in the midst of the bloody carnage. John did not let go. He held Krug's limp body, pressing his head against the back of the appliance so he couldn't break free if he came to. He didn't look at the timer counting down the seconds. He watched the distorted face of his enemy through the darkened glass of the door. In this dark mirror, he also saw the reflection of his own face, and it seemed to him that he was looking at a stranger. Consciousness returned to Krug slowly, through layers of pain and disorientation. First, he felt the tightness and a strange pressure on his neck. Then, a dim light directly in front of his eyes and a growing, unnatural heat. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He let out a muffled groan, and the sound, trapped in the small metal box, was dull and pathetic. And then he understood everything. Terror, pure and primal, the likes of which he had never felt in his life, flooded his mind. He who had always been the predator was now caught in a trap himself. He began to struggle. His body convulsed on the kitchen floor, his legs thrashing against the table legs. He moaned, he screamed, but the sounds were distorted and muffled, turning into a guttural, meaningless gurgle. Through the glass, gruesome electrical sparks could be seen flashing inside. His body shuddered in a final, terrible convulsion and finally went limp. John watched with the icy calm of a surgeon removing a malignant tumor. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in him, only emptiness. A thin, absurdly cheerful chime from the timer rang out. The humming stopped. An absolute ringing silence fell. John released his hands. Krug's body slumped heavily from him to the floor, his head caught in the microwave at an unnatural angle. It was over. Strength left John all at once. The adrenaline that had sustained him through this terrible night was gone. He sank to the floor next to the body of his enemy. His own body was one continuous wound. He looked at his hands. They were covered in blood, his and theirs. He looked at his kitchen. It looked like a slaughterhouse. He looked at himself and did not recognize the man he had been only yesterday. Staggering, he got to his feet. He walked through the wrecked living room, past the bodies of Francis and Sadie, without looking at them. He opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cool, clean night air hit his face. The rain had stopped. Fog hung over the lake, and in it, the dawn was slowly breaking. The world was quiet and peaceful, as if nothing had happened. This silence was unbearable. John sat on the top step, his head in his hands. He was broken, empty, and alone. And then he heard a sound. Quiet at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each second. It was the roar of a motor. He raised his head and looked at the lake. Out of the fog, slowly approaching the dock, was their motorboat. At the stern, gripping the tiller, sat Emma. She was coming back. She hadn't abandoned him. She was coming back for him. John didn't move, just watched as the boat slowly cut through the thick morning fog, leaving a smooth, spreading wake on the mirror-like surface of the water. The sound of the engine was the only thing that seemed real in this nightmarish, surreal dream. It was an anchor, keeping his mind from finally drowning in the abyss of what he had done. He saw Emma's straight, unyielding silhouette, and this simple sight, the sight of his wife returning to him from nowhere, made him stand up. Every muscle in his body screamed in pain. He leaned on the railing to keep from falling. He took one step, then another. It wasn't walking, but a slow, agonizing shuffling of his feet. He went down the porch steps, past the place where Sadie lay without looking, and trudged through the wet grass towards the dock. He clutched his side, feeling the crunch of broken ribs under his fingers. By the time he had hobbled to the dock, Emma had already moored the boat. She killed the engine, and the world was once again plunged into a deafening silence, broken only by the distant cries of birds. She looked at him. Her face was pale and smeared with dirt, with dark shadows under her eyes. There was no victory, no relief in her gaze, only an endless, all-consuming exhaustion and a shared pain that had forever bound them tighter than any vows. They said nothing to each other. Words were unnecessary. They couldn't have described what had happened within the walls of their home anyway. John sat down on the edge of the dock, dangling his legs. Emma reached out and touched his shoulder. It was a light, almost weightless touch, but it held everything. Understanding, forgiveness, complicity. They were in this together, to the very end. "She's breathing," Emma said quietly. She was breathing the whole way. John turned his head and looked into the boat. Mari lay at the bottom, covered with an old tarp. Her face was serene, almost as if in a dream. Her chest rose and fell faintly. She was alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. For this tiny movement, this weak breath, they had turned their home into hell, and he would do it again, without hesitation. They sat like that for a few minutes, in silence, side by side, looking at their daughter. They were a family, maimed, traumatized, forever changed, but still a family. Then they looked back at the house together. In the soft light of dawn, it looked almost normal. A cozy lake house, a dream. But they knew the truth. They didn't see wood and glass, but a tomb, a place where their past life had died. The warm light in the windows, which they had left on, seemed like a mockery, a false beacon of comfort in the midst of a bloodbath. They could never come back here. This lake house was no longer their home. "We have to go," John said. His voice was hoarse and alien. Emma nodded silently. She helped him up. He carefully, wincing in pain, climbed into the boat. He sat next to Mari, placing a hand on her forehead. She was cold. He pressed against her, trying to warm her with his own body. Emma took her place at the helm again. She started the engine. The boat slowly turned and moved away from the dock, leaving behind a house full of corpses and ghosts. They were heading for the opposite shore, for the road, for civilization, for a world in which they now somehow had to live. They were in the middle of the lake when they heard a new sound cutting through the morning silence. At first, it was barely discernible, a thin, insistent wail, but with each second, it grew louder and more distinct. It was a sound they both recognized immediately. It was the sound of sirens. They were getting closer. Police cars were already turning off the highway onto their forest road. Soon they would be here. Soon they would have to explain the unexplainable. John looked at Emma. She looked at him. There was no fear in their eyes for the future, for a trial, for prison. None of that mattered anymore. They had saved their child. They had survived. John turned his gaze to Mari. She was still breathing steadily. He looked at his family, floating in a boat in the middle of a quiet lake, under the wail of approaching sirens, and his face expressed nothing but absolute, infinite devastation. The story of violence had ended, but their own story, the story of the life after, was just beginning, and that's where we'll leave it. But the question remains, what would you have done in their place? Where does protecting your family end and blind rage begin? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video. I'm genuinely interested to read what you think. If deep, intense thrillers like this are what you're looking for, then you've come to the right place. Support the channel with a subscription and hit the like button if the story made an impression on you. It's the best way to thank me for my work. There are many more stories ahead that will keep you up at night. Don't miss out.